Hello and welcome to the Mind Your Career webinar series. My name is Rachel Burkhan-Rammelfanger, and I work with the career development team here at the University of Chicago. I am delighted today for us to have Mimi Darmstadter, who is a professional certified coach from My Life's Work Coaching, her own company, with us today. Mimi's personal interests include creative writing, independent film, photography, fitness for mind and body, and she is inspired by bright colors and beautiful landscapes. She is also an expert in talking about workplace communication. It's my pleasure to hand over the controls to Mimi.
Thanks, Rachel. And before we even get started, I want to just shout out to Rachel for all her support and help over the course of this past month while we were getting this together. I couldn't have done it without her. So I really appreciate that. And I'm happy to be here today. You know, I was thinking it's interesting because it's the last day of the month, which means the new year isn't so new anymore. Somebody reminded me today, actually during my yoga class, that there's a full moon, and full moon always means change and transformation. So maybe today's conversation will inspire a little bit of change and inspiration around change. And finally, I'm from DC, Washington, DC. So obviously this is on our radar screen, perhaps more than other folks in the country. But talking about difficult conversations is another way of talking about the state of our unions with other people. And it's really important to think about our relationships and what we need to do on a regular basis to preserve those relationships. So in essence, this is my State of the Union conversation today. So with that said, we're going to spend about the next hour or so talking about difficult conversations and some tips and strategies so that they don't have to be as hard as they are. This is not easy stuff. I struggle with having those conversations that I know are going to fuel emotion and different perspectives, but I also recognize through my work and my personal life that without having difficult conversations, the ball rarely moves forward. So on that note, that's me. Hair's a little shorter, I'm a little younger, but I'm an executive coach. I do some career transition coaching. I'm certified in numerous leadership 360 assessments and self-assessments. When I'm not coaching, I do human resource consulting, particularly around employee lifecycle issues. So getting talent in the door and making sure that the workforce and the leadership of that workforce remains effective and satisfied in their work. I've spent about 25 years in this space. And even though I was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, I went to the Midwest for school. I have a BA from the University of Michigan, a master's from SSA at the University of Chicago, and I got my coaching certification at Georgetown. So what are today's objectives? To understand and appreciate the business case for effective communication and what it means to have a conversation culture within the workplace. We're going to talk about learning some frameworks for effective feedback conversations. You know, this is a survey course. It's not with an hour, an opportunity to do a deep dive into some of the topics that I'm going to be covering today. So consider this, you're on a tour bus and I'm taking you to a few spots along the route. And at the end, you may decide, you know what, I want to spend more time at that monument. And so you're going to spend more time thinking about some of the topics that I've covered today. But today, just sit back and enjoy the ride. And finally, beyond models that I'm going to share with you, I'm going to talk about some of the skills that are critically important to having effective conversations. Before we get started into the content, though, I am curious, and this is going to be the first polling question, where you come from, what your roles are. So, Rachel, if you could put up that first question, please. I'm just interested in hearing what the group represents in terms of their roles within organizations. So if everyone could vote, are you an organizational executive, a manager of projects but not people? Perhaps you're a manager of people. Do you contribute on an individual basis, so you have no management or supervisory responsibilities, or perhaps you're self-employed? Okay. Well, it looks like, based on the poll, that we do have a range of folks represented here today. It is interesting to me. Everybody has to have difficult conversations, personally and professionally. So your role really doesn't have to. It doesn't have to really matter in terms of what your responsibility is in having difficult conversations. But seems that we have a majority of folks who are either organizational executives or managers in supervisory roles. You guys are the role models for this within your organization, so it's really critical to be able to do this. So hats off to you for being on the call today, and also for, in the future, modeling the behaviors that we're going to be talking about. So this is a quote that I love. Rachel actually was familiar with this quote. I use it in almost every session of anything that I ever teach or facilitate. It's by a gentleman whose work I value so deeply. His name is Parker Palmer, and it's from a gem of a little book called Let Your Life Speak. The pattern is nearly universal. People take copious notes on what the retreat leader says, and they sometimes take notes on the words of certain wise people in the group, but rarely, if ever, do they take notes on what they themselves say. We listen for guidance from everywhere except from within. I urge retreatants to turn their note-taking around, because the words we speak often contain counsel we are trying to give ourselves. And so the reason this quote is important to me, and because we don't have a live audience in front of me in person, I'll just interpret for you today. But the value of this quote is that whenever I teach a class, it's fascinating to me that some folks are madly writing down everything that I say. And I do that too when I'm in a lecture or in a course. In fact, I saw Brene Brown at the National Cathedral a few weeks ago, and there I am taking lots of notes. Despite the fact that I was in this beautiful chapel and I could have been, really more present with her, I was taking down everything she said. And Mr. Palmer's thought here is that, take notes on what you're saying to yourself as opposed to what somebody who pretends to be an expert is saying in front of you. We're all the best experts of our own challenges and our own behaviors. And what Mr. Palmer is trying to say here is that the best wisdom that you can give yourself is the wisdom that comes from within. So that's something that I just encourage everybody to think about as we're talking about today. How does the content implicate or impact you? All right. So moving on, let's set context a little bit for the discussion today. And again, because we have somewhat limited time, I'm not going to be spending a lot of time reviewing all the details of this research. But the reason I share it is there is actually lots of research out there from leading companies, academic institutions, organizations that says that communication and relationship building is critical to the leading of effective organizations and the running of those effective organizations. So McKinsey, in their research of many people at 81 global organizations, found that the highest effectively running organizations found certain traits among its leadership, including the ability to solve problems, seek different perspectives, and support people. And you can't do that in absence of conversation. MIT has found that that patterns of communication are one of the most important predictors of team success in terms of dollar productivity. And what they really looked at is the conversations that happen outside of the formal team meetings. So that if they studied the conversations that people have and the energy around those conversations, and noted that the organizations that sort of have a natural tendency to converse, the people converse outside of those formal meetings are most effective. So ask yourself, you know, when I'm meeting with my team or as a member of a team, how much do we talk amongst ourselves about important matters in the work world or in our work outside of the formal meetings? Or do we just retreat to our corners? And as MIT found, the more that those natural conversations occur, the more likely the organization is going to be successful, as measured in productivity by dollar. Towers Watson leading, and this is what before they switched names again, this is when they were still Towers Watson, leading HR consulting firm worldwide, did some research on ongoing communication and change in their return on investment study. And these results are from 2013 and 14. And they found that there are really stark differences between high and low effective organizations as measured by managers who communicate what is expected, live up to employee promise, explain reasons for changes that happen, engage in two-way dialogue with employees. Two-way meaning, you know, I'm going to listen to you and you're going to listen to me. So it's not just one talking at the other. It's about relationship, not power. Delivering key messages in a meaningful way and listening carefully to different points of view. So, you know, clearly communication is highly correlated to the effective running of an organization. The leadership circle profile, which is one of the 360s in which I am certified, noted a 0.8 correlation between leadership effectiveness and authenticity. And they measure authenticity as the leader's ability, courage to bring up difficult issues and engage in those difficult conversations, and integrity. And finally, emotional intelligence research just says that being emotionally intelligent, which has a lot to do with how we manage our emotions in communication, that the most effective leaders and managers and people, frankly, are people who have high degrees of emotional intelligence, as measured by how they communicate. So the research is clear as day that, and this is one more, just you can see open communication by Ketchum Leadership Monitor and how that affects the success of individual leaders. But the point is that that our effectiveness as individual contributors and as leaders within the workplace is really heavily dependent on our ability to communicate. And so, again, ask yourself, as Parker Palmer would encourage you to do, you know, to what extent am I contributing to the effectiveness of the organization within which I work, or not so because I'm resistant to communicating openly about the things that matter to me and that perhaps matter to other people. All right, so another thing that I wanted to share a little bit of information about are some of the frameworks that that ground or anchor our thinking about communication. There are tons of frameworks out there. They're skeletons, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a while, because we're people, and people live and breathe with emotion and with intent and with assumptions. And so a framework in and of itself isn't going to teach you how to communicate, but it's an important anchor. So I'm just going to give you a few different ways of thinking about communicating, particularly around difficult issues, providing difficult feedback, providing information that's organizationally sensitive, so that you can sort of think about, okay, how do these frameworks affect how I'm approaching things right now? So this is actually a rather new model. It was introduced by a woman named Kim Scott, and I will tell you a little story about Kim Scott. She used to work with Sheryl Sandberg, and I imagine that some people on the phone today know who Sheryl Sandberg is. She's the author of Lean In and Option B. And she and Kim used to work together at Google, I think it was. And they were in a meeting one day, and it was a nerve-wracking meeting because they had to report some new business strategy or something. So there was no clear outcome before it got started. They didn't know how well it would go, and it went well. And Kim was really excited. Cheryl was Kim's boss, and Cheryl was, pleased with the outcome. Kim was very pleased with the outcome. So Kim left the meeting feeling really, really good about things. When Cheryl and her were walking back to wherever their offices, Cheryl shared some really positive feedback with Kim. But Kim could tell as they were chatting that there was a but coming. And so, as Cheryl's sort of pouring on the things that Kim did really well, Kim could sense that there was a but. And the but was Cheryl telling Kim that she said too much. And Kim describes the situation as sort of breathing this huge sigh of relief because she thought maybe she had done something horribly wrong. And Kim said something like, yeah, I know, everybody tells me that. I know that I say a lot and it's something I got to work on. And Cheryl sort of stopped Kim in her tracks and said, no, Kim, you say too much and it makes you look stupid. And from that was born sort of Kim's idea around radical candor, which is really, when done well, the intersection of being able to care personally about the people with whom you communicate and with whom you work, but also the willingness to challenge them directly. It's this intersection that makes difficult, radical, authentic conversations possible. And Cheryl was able to say that to Kim in the way that she did because she also had established a really strong relationship with Kim. I'm not going to say a personal relationship, but a relationship where Kim knew that Cheryl cared about her and cared about her success. Okay? So what we are striving for when we think about our communication with other people, whether it's difficult conversations or not, is this being able to sort of embody this personal care in addition to this willingness to challenge directly. And as Kim calls it, the willingness to piss people off when you need to. So let's just take a look for a minute at what it means to be, personally caring. Being able to be seen as a human with feelings, acknowledging the same in staff and colleagues, poking holes in this buttoned up, I've got to always keep it professional mindset, and managing the sense when it's boss to direct report of hierarchical superiority. You're not better just because you have a different title. And challenging directly means being willing to provide positive and developmental or corrective feedback. So people who challenge directly are also experienced as people who praise. And if you don't praise, which goes into the caring personally piece, then the developmental or corrective feedback is not going to be as effective. Being open to receiving the same, as I said a minute ago, appreciating the inherent casualty of pissing people off. The engagement rules, the willingness to be present and engaged when you are challenging directly. And understanding that people need the opportunity to learn. And that sometimes with challenging directly comes a period of learning and growth. So, second polling question. If I were to ask you whether you think you need to work harder on the caring personally piece of this or the challenging directly piece of this sort of equation, what would you say? You only get to pick one, and it's either challenging directly or being able to convey care for the people with whom you work. So let's see what people say. We'll give it another minute or two. Okay, I think we can stop it. So I always see these results when I do this poll. Invariably, more people say that their challenge is being willing to piss people off, being able and willing to do that, and that doesn't surprise me. You know, we're byproducts of our culture, byproducts of what we've been taught growing up, being byproducts of being taught how to behave. And I hope I've clarified for you that being willing to challenge directly does not mean being mean, and is definitely dependent on this element of care. So if you're only challenging directly, you're not going to be successful. There's got to be some care in it. I will say and challenge the folks for whom care was not a problem, that caring for people with whom you work is more challenging than some people think. It really means giving people the benefit of the doubt and being able to be empathize and put yourself in their shoes. So even though we can sort of nobly say, yes, I care about Jane and Emily and Bob, it's possible that you don't care about them in the way that is necessary to build positive, effective, high-performance relationships. So again, just something to think about. Another model that is, or framework that is often used when we talk about communication is what is called the SBI, and I throw in the C model. So if the model, the radical candor model, was sort of a macro picture of this, this is the micro. Okay, this is, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. How do I give difficult feedback? So what you do is you describe the situation in very specific terms. You describe the behavior that you witnessed in very specific terms. You talk about the impact on that behavior, whether it's on you personally or professionally, or on the organization or the team or the family, because this works in families and community groups and teams and work groups and organizations. And then the often forgotten or dismissed consequences. All right, so I'll repeat that. Specific situation, the specific behavior, the impact that it has had from your perspective on you or the system, whatever that system might be, and then the often forgotten or dismissed consequences of not changing the behavior. All right? Oftentimes, we forget one of these steps, or we don't know one of these steps before we start. It's important to think through all these things before you have the conversation. And the thing that is most critical here is if you are going to have a difficult conversation where you address S, B, and I, if you either leave out the consequences of not changing the behavior of the situation, or you dismiss them in real time later on down the road, then you are not doing anybody, yourself included, a service. It is a huge disservice to everybody if you can't follow through on consequences. I'm a mom. I have 2 teenage sons, and you know, every parent knows that those empty threats get you nowhere. And kids are smart, and so are adults. And if the consequence doesn't exist or is diluted, then all the work you did in front of the talking about the consequence is going to be lost too. So this is just another way to think about providing difficult feedback using the SBI model. As I mentioned a little while ago, this is, you're on a tour bus today. There's obviously a lot that goes into learning this model, which I am happy to provide more detail on. But if you feel like this model might work for you in certain situations, it might be one that you want to learn a little bit more about. All you have to do is Google SBI communication, and you'll see all kinds of stuff. All right. Getting even more in the weeds, I thought it would be useful and important to talk a little bit about feedback and how we successfully give feedback. The first thing, and this overrides everything else that we're talking about, is that there has to be a balance between positive and developmental or improvement feedback. Again, I use the situation of my own children, and I've used this example numerous times when I do training, and I get a lot of nods in the room. You know, your kid comes home from school with a report card, and there are 3 A's, a B, and a C. And the natural tendency is to think about the C first. Now, maybe you're a good enough self-regulator that you don't talk about the C first, but you're thinking, what happened with the C? And talking about the C is going to go a lot farther if you talk about the A's first. All right. So I know that for the folks on the call who didn't think they were getting a little parenting class today, something I've learned and some advice I've learned, but not necessarily heeded every time, is this balance between positive and developmental feedback. And oftentimes it's about our fears. You know, it's about if I don't address the C, this kid isn't going to do as well. Or if I don't address the fact that this guy is coming to work late, despite the fact that he's a wonder child in every other way, then we're going to fail on this project. So it's just really important to think about, how much does this person get to hear the good stuff as well as the not so good stuff? Difficult conversations only have value if they're positive conversations too. Additionally, feedback has to be incredibly specific. That's where people have the most problem. They don't give the specific example. Okay, so whenever you are providing feedback, you have to share the specifics. It has to be immediate. You can't wait a week. You can't wait 2 weeks. You shouldn't wait a month. You should be sharing it almost immediately upon experiencing it. It has to be connected to goals and objectives. So particularly in the workplace, the feedback has to be grounded in something. And typically the most solid grounding is what you expect, what the expectations of the person are, whether formal or informal. It needs to be actionable. If you were to tell somebody that, they're shy, well, that's a personality thing. And maybe you wish for them to be a little bit more outspoken, but that's different than providing corrective feedback. Oftentimes people can't do anything about their level of shyness. Maybe they can take a class, maybe they can read a book, maybe they can take a few risks, but you're going to be more successful if you give feedback around the things that they can actually do something about and that you have ideas of what they can do. All right. Language is really important. It's sort of is an umbrella to some of the stuff I've already been talking about, but language has to be very specific, and generalities can always cause problems. So when I was in an HR role within an organization, we would turn written reviews back when they had words like never, always, sometimes, because they really didn't offer not only the specificity, but the level of, they didn't gauge the problem as effectively or the solution as effectively as we wanted them to. So we always, sent written reviews back that had language that was too general. And then finally, feedback takes courage. You can learn all these 5 steps that come before and still not do it because it's hard and it's scary to talk to somebody about something that's hard and scary. And so the courage piece gets back to radical candor. Do you care enough about this person that you'd be willing to challenge them directly and piss them off? Do you have enough of a relationship with this person that your efforts to challenge them directly, even if you piss them off, will be met with appreciation as opposed to defensiveness? All right. So third polling question, of all these feedback tips, which is the one that you think you need to work on the most? So let's see that. Rachel, if you could pull that up. And you can pick more than one. So let's just see, given what I've said is sort of important to consider when you are delivering negative feedback or corrective feedback, which of these elements do you think you could work a little harder on, or that gets you a little tripped up? Okay, I can't seem to see the last few. Okay, good. What about, okay, let's see. Just taking a look here. All right, I'll say one more thing about its immediacy. As I work with organizations, one trend is organizations are moving away from the annual mid-year and final end-of-year review system. They are turning, and it's a slow trend, but it is indeed a trend, because I'm working with more organizations that want to make this shift to regular feedback cultures. They're doing away with the mid-year and the final review, and they're doing more frequent, regular check-ins. That's a lot more work on some level, but the impact is far greater, because this immediacy question is put to bed. Managers are being trained to give immediate and specific feedback in real time regularly, as opposed to holding everything up until that mid-year or that final year. So for those of you who think that immediacy is a challenge or something you need to work on, please know that it's not only a challenge at the individual level, but organizations are seeking ways to do that more systemically too. All right, so I've given you a few different frameworks in which to think about communication. There was the radical candor, there was the SBI, and then there are just the steps or the important ingredients to providing feedback. But these are skeletons. And the reason I call them skeletons is because what we've left out of all these models is the fact that we're people. And people don't operate linearly. It's not like I'll do step 1, step 2, and step 3, and then everything will be good with the world. These approaches require the consideration of the human element. Humans are emotional, they're reactive, they perceive things in unique ways, and without considering that stuff, conversations that are linear and step-by-step in focus aren't going to be as effective. So the marrow of the effective conversation, the stuff that flows between people, is the next section of this tour today. And some of the things that you need to think about when you move from following steps or following a model to actually engaging another person in conversation. Okay? So what are some of the important skills to turn skeleton into interactions between two human beings? One of the important skills is self-awareness and knowing yourself. Another one is asking powerfully, the ability to ask powerful questions, both as the receiver of feedback and the provider of feedback. And the third set of skills is being able to listen effectively and actively. And finally, pausing. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of these skills. Again, if I were doing a 4-hour training on these topics, we'd be spending, an hour to 2 hours on this slide alone. So this is the trailer to the movie. And if you want to see the whole movie, read about it. I've got a list of books coming up, or give me a call and we can talk more in depth. But this is what we're talking about when we say the marrow. So first, knowing yourself, one conversation at a time. The most important thing to think about before you have a difficult conversation is, what is my goal? And what's driving my goal? Is my goal just to get something off my chest? Or is my goal deeper and more detailed than that? So it's really, really important to understand from the beginning, what are your needs that are inspiring this conversation? In the workplace, your need may be quality, dependability, responsibility, loyalty, achievement, service. There are tons of needs that you may need to leverage to help this conversation have impact. What are your feelings and emotions? Are you mad? Are you sad? Are you glad? Are you happy? Are you excited? Are you worried? Are you concerned? Are you troubled? And your identification of the feeling that is being inspired by this situation is going to be critically helpful to you in humanizing the conversation. And then in return, understanding the feelings and needs of the person with whom you're speaking. What are your requests? So what are you specifically asking of this person with whom you're speaking? Are you simply asking them to listen to you, or are you actually asking them to do something differently? And have you sort of clarified in your own mind what you're asking for before you even start the conversation? Oftentimes I'm in a difficult conversation with someone and I'll simply say, well, what do you want? What do you need from me? And they look at me like, I haven't thought about that yet. So it's really important as you think about your goals, you also think about what am I asking for here? And is it something that this person can really deliver on? What are your offers, promises, or commitments? So a conversation, especially a difficult one, will go much, much better if, in addition to requests, you make offers. What are you willing to do to improve this situation? What are you willing to do to have a positive impact? What are you willing to do to shift the sand between you and the other person? What are you willing to do to help this person help this organization? You know, you may not know that as well, and then it's time again for some self-reflection before you have the conversation. And then finally, knowing yourself is about your emotional intelligence. And this is different than it's tied to, but it is different than the second bullet here, which is about expressing your feelings or emotions. This is about the management of your feelings or emotions. And I'll give you an example. Let's just say that you're in a team meeting and the leader of the team meeting goes off on somebody. He just starts screaming or yelling or showing a level of frustration that is not aligned with the situation at hand. It's quite likely that the person who's leading the meeting who gets angry is not angry at the specific, whatever's going on in the meeting, but something that happened an hour ago or a week ago or interpersonally with one person at the meeting. A person who is emotionally intelligent is going to have a much better perspective on the emotions and their ability to manage those emotions in the situation. All right? So again, 2-day course in and of itself, lots of 360 assessments to measure one's emotional intelligence. But it's really important when you enter into a difficult conversation to ask yourself, how am I managing my emotions around this? And actually, as the receiver of difficult information, as the recipient in a difficult conversation, it's also important to ask yourself, how am I managing my emotions? What do I do differently so I can manage my emotions effectively in this conversation. All right, so a polling question. I want you all to think about a time or a time coming up, either past or future, where you have had to or you anticipate having to have a difficult conversation. It can be personal or professional because all this stuff relates to both. Which of these topics, your needs, your feelings and emotions, your requests, your offers, or your management of your emotions, are the ones that you need to develop a little bit more self-awareness about? Okay, and you can pick more than one. So when you're going into those conversations, which of these topics or issues is getting neglected by you? And which ones call for you to do a little bit more self-reflection before you have that conversation? All right, so let's close the poll and see how we did here. All right, so it looks like emotional intelligence is high on the list, followed by your requests and your needs. I mean, they all got equal, with emotional intelligence being considerably higher. As I said, there are tons of books. I'll talk about them in a minute around emotional intelligence. Lots of information out there. The fact that you all scored over 30% on each of these just confirms my long-term belief that there's so much work that we can do as individuals before we have these difficult conversations that has nothing to do with the other person. Okay, remember, I'm sure you've all heard the saying that that we can't change another person's behavior, we can only change our own. These are examples of how you can change your own behavior before you even go into that difficult conversation. All right, so what are some other skills? Again, one-day courses in and of themselves. One of them is to be able to ask really good questions. Okay, I'll share another example from the world of parenting. Your kid comes home from school and you ask them, how was your day? And I would say 9 out of 10 parents get a version of the same response, fine. The reason you get fine as a response is because you have asked a really bad question. Asking good questions means that you don't know the response before you ask the question, that you're asking a question for which you do not know the answer, that it's open-ended, they can't answer the question in 1 or 2 words, that you're really curious about the response, that you're willing to be surprised, that the response that you get may not be the response that you expect, that you've asked questions that begin with what and how and if, that you've been really creative in your asking of questions. Okay, so think about, and when we talk about marrow, asking questions is really a marrow kind of skill, because it moves from I'm following a model to I'm engaging another person in conversation. And one of the best ways to engage somebody in conversation is by asking them questions. One of my favorite questions when I'm sharing difficult feedback or having a difficult conversation is, how can we talk about this in a solutions-oriented way? So even before you start sharing the feedback or sharing your side of the story, it's like, what's a way that we can have this conversation that's solution-oriented? When you ask questions and you're open to the other person asking questions, you're really leveling the playing field. Okay? Another important skill is being able to listen effectively. You know, again, we could spend a lot of time in how to listen effectively class, and I would just say that it's really, really important to be very fully present and listening to the other person's point of view. And I will speak from my own personal experience. When I'm having a difficult conversation, I am laser focused on getting through the conversation and not being derailed from the conversation. And those two, self-imposed goals typically result in me not listening to the other person. I'm in a hurry and I'm laser focused on my needs and not the other person. And as a result, I oftentimes don't pay attention to what the other person is saying. And then finally, I think one of the most critical skills that we need to leverage in a difficult conversation is the art of the pause. Pausing before you have the conversation, and that's all about that reflection and prep that you have to do in advance. Pausing within the conversation, during the conversation, if things are getting heated or confused or complex or muddied, just saying, let's take a break. Would it be okay if we took a break? And then pausing after the conversation to take a deep breath and just ask yourself, okay, what happened and how did it go? Pausing, I'll say a few more things about pausing. Pausing is not comfortable for people who were born and raised in Western culture. We're in a rush. And as somebody who lives on the East Coast, it's hard for people on the East Coast particularly. We're in a rush. We want to get through things. We don't want to focus on the things that are difficult, so we hurry. So pausing is not in our DNA, and it needs to be. Okay? Pausing is uncomfortable during conversations because there are those awkward silences. But sometimes that awkward silence breathes space into a conversation that otherwise is dying on the vine. Okay, so I would just encourage you all to think about pausing. And if you want to take it a step further, the extent to which your ability to manage your emotions gets in the way of your ability to pause. And I'll share another example. I am also guilty of this, but it's the situation when you get an email that really pisses you off or makes you angry, and the first thing you do is you send off a maladaptive response without taking that deep breath ahead of time. We do that all the time. Everybody is guilty of that. And the pause becomes really effective at times when we're being triggered. We don't have a lot of impulse control, and we respond without taking a deep breath ahead of time. So next poll question, of these three sort of anchoring or grounding skills, which one do you think you're best at? Asking questions, listening effectively, or pausing? And just select one, please, this time. Okay, well, let's see. We've got pausing is the one that seems to be least leveraged as an optimal skill by folks. It might be because you haven't thought about it that much, but I would just encourage people to think about the pause as a way of not only helping the other person, but helping you. Rachel, can we see those? I don't know if the results have been showed by everybody. I can see them on one screen, but not the other.
I think they should all be able to see them.
Okay. All right. Okay, they just came up. Great. All right. So I wanted to share a few quotes before we ended today and opened up to a few questions. I love quotes. One is about a workplace behavior that I think transcends all the stuff we've been talking about today. and it's the acceptance of personal responsibility. It's what separates the superior person from the average person. Make this decision, live by it, and go from being average to superior. I'm in. Ultimately, having difficult conversations is about individual choice. And I get that having difficult conversations is scary and uncomfortable and may not go as planned and can make things worse before it makes things better. But the choice or the decision to engage in a difficult conversation is really about personal responsibility and professional responsibility and the willingness to go to the edge with somebody if you think it's going to improve your relationship with them or the quality of the work product or the experience of the workplace. So wanted to share that. And then two other quotes. One by Seneca, it is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that things are difficult. It's going to be a lot harder in the long run for you and your work environment in the absence of having these types of conversations. It may seem like going to the mat with somebody, and I'm being a little flippant here, is going to be hard, but in the long run, it's a lot harder to stay silent. And as my yoga teacher said one day, which really resonated with me, the only way out is through. And so the only way out of a difficult conversation is through it. And I encourage everybody who's been on the call today to take some baby steps and challenging themselves to have those hard, sweaty conversations. I've listed out a bunch of books that I think speak to these topics in profound ways. I say read more about it because we all have different learning styles, and reading is not the chosen learning style for everybody. All these people have TED Talks and YouTube videos and other books and articles in in HBR, Harvard Business Review. So I would encourage you to pay as much attention to the names as the titles, because invariably you will be able to find stuff by these people that does not only show up in a book. With that, I welcome some conversations. I know that I went a little long, but we still have time for questions if people want to pose anything to me. I've been talking for an hour and I want to hear from you.
We do have a few questions, Mimi. One is, how do you get people to stop talking over you? For example, someone asks you a question, they answer or you answer, and then they reiterate what you just said.
Can you ask that again? Because I'm not sure I hear that as talking over you.
Yeah, what it says is, so you ask someone a question and they might answer, or they might reiterate what you've just said as their answer.
Yeah, sometimes you have to ask them another question. I mean, one of the skills that I learned in coaching is that asking questions is not necessarily a one-shot deal. And if you're not getting the response you want, I may not be understanding the question that you posed, Rachel, accurately, but in many situations, the answer to the question that you get may not reveal what you need. And you can say something like, let me try that another way. Or I'm not sure that and own it. I'm not sure that I articulated the question in a way that I wanted to. Can I give it another try? So I'm not sure if I understood the question completely, but if I did, that's how I would respond.
Great. Another question that we have from our attendees is, if you're an individual contributor and you're speaking to your manager, do you have any advice about giving immediate feedback to your manager?
Yeah, okay, so that's, first thing, I'm thrilled to hear the question because this should be an equal playing field. I know that it's harder when you're trying to manage up. My advice would, well, I'm going to start with a few questions. It so depends on the culture of the organization, and it also depends on the relationship between the two people involved. Some organizations are really, really great about this is a feedback culture. Managers seek and want feedback from their staff. They're open to it. They listen to it. They engage in it. And some cultures are not like that. And that is going to have a lot of bearing, not with whether you do it, but how you do it. So the first thing I would ask the person who posed this question is, what's the culture like and what's your relationship like with this manager? If it's relatively positive, then a lot of what we talked about will apply. If it's not positive, then there really has to be some starting from ground zero, some real establishment of norms and rules of engagement around how do we discuss the difficult issues.
Yeah, and
but
Mimi,
it's not easy.
Our asker said she has a defensive manager.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious whether saying I have feedback to share, and I would have to know more about the situation to really coach around this. But I have feedback to share. Well, first I would ask the questioner, what's her goal? What is she seeking from her manager? And what are her concerns? And what's the opportunity for her in having this conversation? And then we would go down the list of concerns and try to address them. So that's somewhat of the process of how I better understand her situation. But that all being said, I think being pretty transparent that there's feedback that wants to be shared, that you want to do it in a safe and comfortable way. How can we talk about this in a way that's solution oriented and honors both of our perspectives? And would it be okay if she shared feedback and then heard the response? Again, really hard to coach on this issue without understanding more. But I would start with what's her goal, what are the challenges she anticipates, what are her fears, and where are there opportunities for moving the ball forward with this person if she has the conversation, and then how do you go about it?
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Which is, how should we deal with colleagues who are disrespectful?
Okay, I mean, these are great questions. So I'm curious what disrespectful means. It means different things to different people. I love organizations that have established behavioral expectations of all staff. It is a lot easier, again, to address issues like disrespect when the organization has established norms around that. I hear with disrespect as a need not being met. So one thing that you may want to turn to, and I'm going to go back to this slide if people can still see it, when you have a conversation with somebody who's being disrespectful, you would share the specific feedback, and then you might say, I have a need for respect. And this is a situation where you own it. You don't say you're being disrespectful. I have a need for respect, and I'm feeling uncomfortable in a situation where I feel disrespected. So there may be an opportunity to leverage a need here. But again, ideally, you're within an organizational culture that has established some norms or ground rules about this. And for the people who are asking questions along this line or who have questions along this line, I would certainly encourage you to think about not only how do I shift my relationship with a person, but how do I shift the culture within this organization? And it's really hard to do this if you're just one person, but you can have conversations about culture change as a starting point.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming and listening to our presentation. And thank you, Mimi, for this great advice. I just want to remind everybody that in February, we'll be talking more about change. On February 13th, we'll have a webinar about career transitions, deciding if one is right for you. And we hope you'll join us again. Thank you all so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.